The lunch rush was in full swing at a busy downtown restaurant, with waiters weaving through tables, balancing trays, and delivering meals to impatient customers. The air was filled with the enticing aroma of sizzling dishes and the buzz of casual conversation. Among the crowd, a woman stepped in, her presence quiet but noticeable. Dressed simply in a soft cardigan and jeans, she carried herself with a calm demeanor. She glanced around, her eyes sparkling with curiosity, as if she were seeing the place for the first time. She approached the host station, but before she could even say a word, a waiter stormed over, his expression sharp. His polished uniform was pristine, but his attitude carried an air of superiority. Without so much as a welcoming smile, he looked her up and down, his nose subtly wrinkling, and asked with a tone that barely concealed his disdain, "Do you have a reservation?" The woman, unfazed by his coldness, smiled politely and replied, "No, I was hoping to get a table for one. Is that possible?" He let out a short, sarcastic laugh and shook his head. "For one? At this hour? Lady, we're packed. You should have thought about that before just walking in." His voice was loud enough to draw glances from nearby tables, and the woman could feel the weight of curious stares. She hesitated, her smile faltering for just a moment. "I understand it's busy, but I'm happy to wait. I heard great things about this place and wanted to experience it for myself." The waiter scoffed and gestured dramatically toward the dining area. "Sure, you and every other person in town. But we don't just let anyone waltz in. This isn't a diner, you know." The woman blinked, taken aback by his tone. "I'm sorry if I've done something to upset you," she said softly, her voice calm despite the growing tension. "I really don't mind waiting." But her patience only seemed to irritate him further. With an exaggerated sigh, he turned and muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear, "Unbelievable. These people think they can just show up like they're doing us a favor." The woman's cheeks flushed, though whether it was from embarrassment or something else, it wasn't clear. She shifted on her feet, her fingers clutching the strap of her bag a little tighter. A few nearby customers whispered among themselves, exchanging looks that ranged from pity to amusement. The waiter, seemingly oblivious to the growing discomfort in the room, turned back to the woman with a fake smile plastered on his face. "Look, if you're so desperate, you can wait at the bar, but don't hold your breath. We're fully booked for hours." The woman nodded, her expression unreadable, and quietly made her way toward the bar area as he had suggested. She sat down on one of the stools, glancing around the room. From her vantage point, she could see the busy dining area, the bustling kitchen in the back, and of course, the waiter, who was now back to charming a table of well-dressed patrons as if the earlier exchange hadn't happened. As she sat, the bartender approached her with a warm smile, the first genuine one she'd received since stepping into the restaurant. "Hi there, what can I get for you?" She returned the smile, grateful for his kindness. "Just water, please." "Of course," he said, filling a glass and placing it in front of her. "Let me know if you need anything else." She thanked him and took a sip of water, her mind clearly elsewhere. Her gaze lingered on the waiter, who was now laughing at something one of the patrons had said, his demeanor a stark contrast to the rudeness he had shown her moments ago. Little did he know, his actions had been witnessed by more than just the woman he'd humiliated, and soon he would come to learn just how big of a mistake he'd made. For now, though, the woman remained seated at the bar, her expression calm but thoughtful. The story was far from over, and what happened next would not only shock the rude waiter, but everyone in the room. As the woman sat at the bar, sipping her water and occasionally glancing at the waiter who had brushed her off, she couldn't help but notice the stark contrast in his behavior. He was all smiles now, leaning in slightly as he spoke to a group at one of the center tables. His tone was warm, his gestures animated, and his laugh contagious enough to make the diners join in. To anyone watching, he was the epitome of professionalism, the kind of waiter who could make a night out feel special. But she had already seen the other side of him, the side that didn't care to hide his disdain for someone he thought was unimportant. The bartender, sensing her quiet demeanor, decided to strike up a conversation. "First time here?" he asked, his voice friendly but casual. She nodded, setting her glass down. "It is. I've heard a lot about this place. Figured I'd see what all the buzz was about." Well, the lunch rush was in full swing at a busy downtown restaurant, with waiters weaving through tables, balancing trays, and delivering meals to impatient customers. The air was filled with the enticing aroma of sizzling dishes and the buzz of casual conversation. Among the crowd, a woman stepped in, her presence quiet but noticeable. Dressed simply in a soft cardigan and jeans, she carried herself with a calm demeanor. She glanced around, her eyes sparkling with curiosity, as if she were seeing the place for the first time. She approached the host station, but before she could even say a word, a waiter stormed over, his expression sharp. His polished uniform was pristine, but his attitude carried an air of superiority. Without so much as a welcoming smile, he looked her up and down, his nose subtly wrinkling, and asked with a tone that barely concealed his disdain, "Do you have a reservation?" The woman, unfazed by his coldness, smiled politely and replied, "No, I was hoping to get a table for one. Is that possible?" He let out a short, sarcastic laugh and shook his head. "For one? At this hour? Lady, we're packed. You should have thought about that before just walking in." His voice was loud enough to draw glances from nearby tables, and the woman could feel the weight of curious stares. She hesitated, her smile faltering for just a moment. "I understand it's busy, but I'm happy to wait. I heard great things about this place and wanted to experience it for myself." The waiter scoffed and gestured dramatically toward the dining area. "Sure, you and every other person in town. But we don't just let anyone waltz in. This isn't a diner, you know." The woman blinked, taken aback by his tone. "I'm sorry if I've done something to upset you," she said softly, her voice calm despite the growing tension. "I really don't mind waiting." But her patience only seemed to irritate him further. With an exaggerated sigh, he turned and muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear, "Unbelievable. These people think they can just show up like they're doing us a favor." The woman's cheeks flushed, though whether it was from embarrassment or something else, it wasn't clear. She shifted on her feet, her fingers clutching the strap of her bag a little tighter. A few nearby customers whispered among themselves, exchanging looks that ranged from pity to amusement. The waiter, seemingly oblivious to the growing discomfort in the room, turned back to the woman with a fake smile plastered on his face. "Look, if you're so desperate, you can wait at the bar, but don't hold your breath. We're fully booked for hours." The woman nodded, her expression unreadable, and quietly made her way toward the bar area as he had suggested. She sat down on one of the stools, glancing around the room. From her vantage point, she could see the busy dining area, the bustling kitchen in the back, and, of course, the waiter, who was now back to charming a table of well-dressed patrons, as if the earlier exchange hadn't happened. As she sat, the bartender approached her with a warm smile, the first genuine one she'd received since stepping into the restaurant. "Hi there, what can I get for you?" She returned the smile, grateful for his kindness. "Just water, please." "Of course," he said, filling a glass and placing it in front of her. "Let me know if you need anything else." She thanked him and took a sip of water, her mind clearly elsewhere. Her gaze lingered on the waiter, who was now laughing at something one of the patrons had said, his demeanor a stark contrast to the rudeness he had shown her moments ago. Little did he know, his actions had been witnessed by more than just the woman he humiliated, and soon he would come to learn just how big of a mistake he'd made. For now, though, the woman remained seated at the bar, her expression calm but thoughtful. The story was far from over, and what happened next would not only shock the rude waiter, but everyone in the room. As the woman sat at the bar, sipping her water and occasionally glancing at the waiter who had brushed her off, she couldn't help but notice the stark contrast in his behavior. He was all smiles now, leaning in slightly as he spoke to a group at one of the center tables. His tone was warm, his gestures animated, and his laugh contagious enough to make the diners join in. To anyone watching, he was the epitome of professionalism, the kind of waiter who could make a night out feel special. But she had already seen the other side of him, the side that didn't care to hide his disdain for someone he thought was unimportant. The bartender, sensing her quiet demeanor, decided to strike up a conversation. "First time here?" he asked, his voice friendly but casual. "Oh, picked a busy time," he said with a chuckle, glancing over his shoulder at the packed dining area. "This place gets pretty crazy during lunch, but it's worth the wait. The food's incredible." "I've heard that too," she replied, her tone polite but distant. The bartender tilted his head slightly, studying her. "If you don't mind me saying, you look like you're waiting for someone. Meeting a friend." The woman smiled faintly, but didn't answer directly. "Just observing for now." The bartender seemed to sense she wasn't in the mood to share much, so he nodded and returned to his work, leaving her to her thoughts. From her spot, she could see everything. How the kitchen doors swung open every few seconds as plates piled high with food were carried out, how the hostess juggled answering the phone while managing walk-ins, and how the waiter moved from table to table with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. She couldn't help but wonder how often he treated people the way he had treated her. Was it a one-time lapse in judgment, or was this just who he was? And if it was the latter, how had no one noticed? A few moments later, the waiter passed by the bar, his tray empty but his posture straight and purposeful. He didn't spare her a glance as he walked by, but she caught snippets of his conversation with another staff member. "Table 3's complaining about the wait," the other waiter said, sounding harried. "Let them complain," he replied dismissively. "What do they think this is, fast food? They'll survive." The woman's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly around her glass. It was becoming increasingly clear that this wasn't just a bad day for him. This was a pattern. As the minutes ticked by, she noticed other details that most patrons probably wouldn't. The way he would prioritize tables with wealthier-looking guests, offering them extra attention and perks, while brushing off others with curt responses. The way his smile faded the moment he turned away from a table, as though he couldn't be bothered to maintain the facade for even a second longer than necessary. It wasn't long before the waiter noticed her sitting at the bar. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowing slightly, before walking over. "Still here?" he asked, his tone lacking the warmth he showed his tables. She met his gaze calmly. "I didn't realize there was a time limit." He forced a laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. "No, but this isn't exactly a waiting room. If you're not ordering anything, we need the space." The bartender, who had overheard the exchange, stepped in. "She's fine where she is," he said, his tone firm but polite. "I've got it covered." The waiter shot him a look but didn't argue. Instead, he turned back to the woman with a tight smile. "Enjoy your water," he said before walking away. She watched him go, her expression neutral but thoughtful. There was something about his attitude that struck a nerve, not because she was personally offended, but because she could see how his behavior might affect others. How many customers had he made feel unwelcome? How many had left the restaurant thinking less of the place because of him? At one point, a young couple walked in, their clothes simple but neat, and approached the host's stand. They looked nervous, as though they weren't sure if they belonged in a place like this. The hostess was about to seat them when the waiter stepped in, his expression sharp. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his tone mirroring the one he'd used with her earlier. The couple exchanged a glance before the man replied, "No, but we were hoping." "We're full," the waiter interrupted, his voice curt. "Maybe try somewhere else." The woman at the bar watched the exchange closely, her jaw tightening slightly as the couple walked out, looking embarrassed. She could feel the tension in the room, the subtle shift in the atmosphere as a few diners glanced toward the door, clearly having witnessed what had happened. But the waiter didn't seem to notice or care. He was already back to charming another table, his smile as bright as ever. The woman leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable as she continued to observe. She wasn't just here for a meal. That much was clear. She was here for a reason, and while no one else in the restaurant seemed to know it yet, that reason was becoming more apparent with every passing moment. The staff bustled around her, too busy to notice the quiet determination in her eyes. The waiter, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface, carried on as though he owned the place. But his time was running out, and when the truth finally came to light, it would leave everyone in the room stunned. For now, though, the woman remained seated at the bar, patient and composed, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal who she truly was and why she had come. The tension in the room grew, though most of the diners were too preoccupied with their meals to notice. At the bar, the woman continued to sit quietly, her presence understated but deliberate. She watched as the waiter darted between tables, his charming act still firmly in place. It was almost impressive how easily he switched gears, flashing a smile one moment and muttering complaints under his breath the next. But as seamless as his performance seemed, cracks were beginning to show. A family at one of his tables flagged him down, the father gesturing to their plates as he spoke in a low voice. The waiter's smile faltered briefly, and though he quickly recovered, the irritation in his eyes was unmistakable. He leaned closer to the table, his tone barely polite as he explained something, then whisked their plates away with a sharp turn. The woman noticed the way the father's shoulders tensed, the subtle shake of his head as he exchanged a look with his wife. They weren't happy, and it was clear the waiter had done little to address their concerns. Still, he carried on as if nothing had happened, moving to the next table with his trademark grin. The bartender returned to where the woman was seated, his hands busy drying a glass. "That guy's something else, huh?" he muttered under his breath, keeping his voice low enough that no one else could hear. She raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, glancing toward the waiter to make sure he was out of earshot. "Let's just say he's not exactly a team player. He's great with certain customers, but if he doesn't think you're worth his time." The bartender trailed off, shaking his head. "It's a pattern, and honestly, it's getting old." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she turned her attention back to the dining area, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched the waiter approach a new table. It was a young mother with two small children, their table tucked into a corner near the window. The woman had dark circles under her eyes, and her movements were slow, as though she were running on empty. One of the children, a boy no older than 5, was bouncing in his seat, chattering excitedly, while the other, a toddler, was fidgeting in a high chair. The waiter approached with visible reluctance, his expression neutral but his posture stiff. He took their order quickly, his tone clipped, and walked away before the mother could ask for anything extra. When he returned with their food, he set the plates down with little care, his attention already drifting to the next table. "Excuse me," the mother said, her voice soft but hesitant. "Could I get a cup of milk for the little one?" The waiter barely glanced at her as he replied, "I'll see what I can do," before walking off without another word. The woman at the bar clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around her glass. She could feel the frustration radiating from the young mother, who looked down at her plate with a defeated expression. It was a small request, and yet the waiter had brushed it off as if it were an inconvenience. A few minutes later, the mother tried to flag him down again, but he ignored her, his focus entirely on a larger table where the guests were dressed in designer clothes and laughing loudly. The woman at the bar could see the mother's face fall, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment, as she realized she wasn't going to get the help she needed. The bartender noticed too and shook his head. "It's not right," he said quietly, his voice tinged with frustration. "She's got her hands full, and he can't even bother to be decent." The woman didn't respond, but her expression darkened slightly. She had seen enough. A few minutes later, the waiter approached the bar to pick up a tray of drinks. He didn't acknowledge her as he grabbed the glasses, his focus entirely on his task. But as he turned to leave, she spoke up. "You seem busy," she said, her tone calm but pointed. He paused, glancing at her over his shoulder. "It's called working," he replied, his voice laced with sarcasm. "You should try it sometime." The bartender's eyes widened slightly, but the woman remained composed. "I do," she said simply. "And I've learned that how you treat people says a lot about who you are." The waiter scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Okay, lecture noted. Anything else?" She held his gaze for a moment before shaking her head. "Not yet." He didn't wait for a follow-up, walking away with the drinks and muttering something under his breath. The woman turned back to the bartender, who looked as though he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Instead, he busied himself with cleaning up the bar, leaving her to her thoughts. As the lunch rush began to wind down, the restaurant grew quieter, the energy in the room shifting. The waiter seemed to relax, his pace slowing as the number of tables he had to manage dwindled. But the woman remained at the bar, her presence a silent reminder that something was brewing. At one point, the restaurant manager emerged from the back, a clipboard in hand as he surveyed the dining area. He was an older man with a kind face, his demeanor professional but approachable. The waiter immediately straightened up when he saw him, his smile returning in full force. "Everything running smoothly?" the manager asked, his eyes sweeping the room. "Of course," the waiter replied, his tone bright and cheerful. "No problems at all." The manager nodded, satisfied, and disappeared back into the kitchen. The woman at the bar watched the exchange with interest, a faint smirk playing at the corners of her lips. She could see how carefully the waiter had curated his image, how he only let certain parts of himself show depending on who was watching. But the truth had a way of surfacing, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks in his facade became impossible to ignore. As the last of the lunch crowd began to filter out, the woman finally stood, leaving a few bills on the bar as she thanked the bartender for his kindness. She didn't leave, though. Instead, she moved toward the dining area, her posture relaxed but purposeful. The waiter spotted her and frowned, his confusion evident. "You're still here?" he asked, his tone more annoyed than surprised. She didn't answer right away, taking her time as she walked up to one of the empty tables near the center of the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "I think it's time we had a conversation," she said, her eyes locking onto his. The waiter blinked, taken aback by her sudden shift in demeanor. "About what?" She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "About the way you treat people." He laughed nervously, glancing around as if expecting someone to back him up. "Look, I don't know what your deal is, but—" Before he could finish, the door to the kitchen swung open, and the manager stepped out again. His eyes immediately landed on the woman, and his expression shifted from neutral to surprised. "Ma'am," he said, his tone a mixture of respect and uncertainty. The waiter froze, his confusion deepening as he looked between the two of them. "Wait, you know her?" he asked, his voice faltering. The woman didn't answer, her gaze steady as she waited for the manager to speak. The room felt heavier now, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. And just like that, the balance of power shifted, leaving the waiter to wonder who this woman really was and how much trouble he might be in. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the manager walked closer, his usually calm demeanor now marked by an unmistakable nervousness. The waiter, who moments earlier had been so confident, shifted uneasily on his feet, trying to piece together what was happening. He had no idea why this woman commanded such attention, but it was becoming increasingly clear that she wasn't just an ordinary diner. "Of course I know her," the manager finally said, his tone edged with something that resembled both respect and worry. "This is—" He stopped himself, glancing at the woman as if seeking permission to continue. She gave a small nod, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Go ahead," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The manager turned back to the waiter, his expression now unreadable. "This is the owner's wife." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Conversations at the surrounding tables halted, forks hovered midair, and the once lively hum of the restaurant dissolved into stunned silence. For a moment, it felt as though even the air had thickened. The waiter's face drained of color. "What?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at the woman as if seeing her for the first time, his arrogance crumbling into sheer panic. I didn't know." She didn't react right away, letting his words hang in the air as she regarded him with a measured gaze. The silence stretched, every second feeling heavier than the last. When she finally spoke, her tone was even, though her words carried an undeniable weight. "Exactly," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You didn't know. And yet you thought it was acceptable to treat me and others with such disrespect. Tell me, would it have made a difference if you had known who I was?" The waiter opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was scrambling for an answer, his mind racing to find something, anything, that might save him. I was just having a bad day," he managed to say, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean anything by it." She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "A bad day?" she repeated, her tone cool. "Is that how you justify ignoring a young mother's request, dismissing a family's concerns, and turning away a couple who only wanted a table to eat? Do you have bad days often?" The waiter swallowed hard, his palms sweating as he glanced around the room. The eyes of the staff and remaining diners were all on him now, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he never had before. I didn't realize," he said weakly, his voice trailing off. The woman tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Didn't realize what?" "That people deserve kindness and respect, regardless of who they are or what they look like." The room was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Even the manager seemed unsure of what to do, his eyes darting between the woman and the waiter as though waiting for someone to break the tension. But before anyone could speak, the door to the kitchen swung open again, and another figure stepped out. It was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a crisp white shirt and slacks, his presence commanding yet approachable. He glanced around the room, taking in the scene, before his eyes landed on the woman. "There you are," he said, a warm smile breaking across his face. "I was wondering when you'd make your move." The waiter's head snapped toward him, and his stomach dropped as recognition set in. This was the owner, the man whose name was on the sign outside, the man who was technically his boss. And now, he realized with growing dread, the woman he had treated so poorly was not just the owner's wife, but someone who clearly had a significant influence on the restaurant. The owner walked over to his wife, leaning in to kiss her cheek before turning his attention to the waiter. His smile faded, replaced by an expression of quiet disappointment. "I think you owe my wife, and quite a few others, an apology," he said, his tone calm but firm. The waiter stammered, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to find the right thing to say. I'm so sorry," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." The owner held up a hand, cutting him off. "Stop," he said. "This isn't about what you meant. It's about what you did. And this isn't the first time we've had complaints about your behavior, is it?" The waiter's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He felt as though the walls were closing in around him, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. The owner glanced at his wife, his expression softening. "I think you should handle this," he said. "You've seen enough to know what needs to be done." She nodded, her eyes never leaving the waiter. For a moment, she said nothing, letting the silence stretch as she considered her next move. The room was still, everyone waiting to see what she would do. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, the door to the restaurant swung open, and a familiar face stepped inside. It was the young mother who had been ignored earlier, her 2 children in tow. She hesitated near the entrance, her expression uncertain, as though she wasn't sure if she should have come back. The woman at the center of it all smiled gently and gestured for her to come forward. "Please," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "Come in." The mother hesitated for only a moment before walking over, her children clinging to her sides. The toddler was fussy, and the older boy looked tired, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes as she approached. "Is everything okay?" the woman asked, her tone soft but concerned. The mother nodded hesitantly. I just wanted to say that I wasn't trying to cause trouble earlier," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to be a bother." The woman's expression softened further, and she shook her head. "You weren't a bother at all," she said firmly. "And you shouldn't feel like you have to apologize for simply asking for what you need." The mother blinked, clearly taken aback by her kindness. The woman turned to the manager and owner, her voice steady. "Make sure they're taken care of. Everything on the house." The owner nodded immediately, gesturing for the manager to escort the family to a table. The mother looked as though she might cry, her gratitude evident as she murmured her thanks. As they were seated, the woman turned her attention back to the waiter. Her expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to her voice as she spoke. "This restaurant isn't just about food," she said. "It's about people, about making them feel welcome, valued, and respected. You've forgotten that, and it's not something we can overlook." The waiter's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was a reckoning. And while he didn't know what the ultimate outcome would be, he knew one thing for certain. He had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. The waiter stood frozen, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. His mind raced with possible outcomes, each more grim than the last. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the clinking of dishes being cleared away and the hushed murmurs of a few lingering diners. All eyes were on the woman, who remained calm and composed, exuding a quiet authority that made it clear she was in control. The owner crossed his arms, standing beside his wife. Though he hadn't said much, his presence alone was a reminder of the stakes. The waiter knew he wasn't just answering to her now. He was on trial before the man who held his employment in his hands. "You're right," the waiter finally said, his voice low and trembling. "I've been awful. I don't have an excuse for how I acted." He paused, looking at the young mother across the room, then at the other tables he'd dismissed earlier. "I let my frustrations get the better of me. I see that now. I'm sorry." For a moment, it seemed like his apology might soften the woman's resolve. Her expression shifted slightly, as if she were considering his words. But then she glanced around the room, her gaze settling on the young mother who was now seated with her children, being served by another waiter who smiled kindly and went out of his way to ensure they were comfortable. "An apology is a start," she said finally, her tone measured. "But words alone don't undo the harm you've caused. This isn't just about today. It's about the pattern of behavior we've seen and the way it affects our customers and our team." The waiter's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked genuinely remorseful. He opened his mouth to speak again, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Before we decide how to move forward, I want to hear from someone else," she said, turning to the bartender. "You've worked alongside him. What do you think?" The bartender blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting to be pulled into the conversation. He hesitated, glancing at the waiter, who looked at him with a mixture of hope and desperation. The room seemed to hold its breath as the bartender finally spoke. "He's not a bad guy," the bartender said carefully, his voice steady. "But he's got a temper, and he doesn't always think about how his actions affect others. There've been complaints before, from staff and customers, and, well, it's been building up." The woman nodded, as though she had anticipated this answer. She turned back to the waiter, her expression neutral. "Do you have anything else to say for yourself?" The waiter hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he said softly. "I've said enough. I'll accept whatever decision you make. The owner stepped forward, his voice firm but not unkind. This isn't just about consequences. It's about growth. If you're willing to make a real effort to change, to take responsibility for your actions and rebuild trust, then there's a chance to move forward. But if you're not, he let the words hang in the air, the implication clear. The waiter nodded slowly, his face a mix of relief and determination. I'll do whatever it takes, he said. I want to do better. The woman studied him for a long moment, as though trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. Finally, she sighed and glanced at her husband. Let's give him one more chance, she said, her voice soft but firm. But with conditions. The owner nodded in agreement. Effective immediately, you'll undergo training on customer service and teamwork, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You'll also start with a probationary period where your behavior will be closely monitored. One misstep, and there won't be another conversation. The waiter swallowed hard, but he nodded. Thank you, he said, his voice trembling with genuine gratitude. I won't let you down. The tension in the room began to ease as the resolution unfolded. The diners returned to their meals, and the staff resumed their duties, though a palpable sense of change lingered in the air. The waiter seemed humbled, his demeanor subdued as he returned to his station, ready to begin making amends. The woman, satisfied with the outcome, turned to her husband. I think that wraps things up, she said with a small smile. Time to head home. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. You always know how to handle things, he said, admiration evident in his tone. But just as they prepared to leave, the restaurant door opened again, and a sharply dressed man walked in, carrying a sleek briefcase. He scanned the room briefly before his eyes landed on the owner and his wife. His expression was one of polite urgency as he approached them. Mr. and Mrs. Hall, he asked, his voice calm but firm. I'm here on behalf of the building's landlord. The couple exchanged a glance, their smiles fading. Is there an issue? The owner asked, his tone cautious. The man nodded. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding with the lease agreement. There's a clause that was overlooked during the renewal process, and, well, it could complicate things for the business. The woman's expression shifted, her calm exterior faltering for the first time that day. What kind of complications? She asked, her voice tight. The man opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. It seems the lease terms allow for the property to be reclaimed if certain conditions aren't met. Unfortunately, the landlord has decided to enforce that clause. The restaurant seemed to fall silent once again, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. The owner looked stunned, his usually confident demeanor shaken. Reclaimed. He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. When? The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Immediately, he said. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. The landlord is within their rights. The woman's mind raced as she tried to process the sudden turn of events. Just when she thought the day's challenges were behind them, a new, even larger obstacle had appeared. But instead of panicking, she straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. We'll see about that, she said firmly, her voice filled with determination. This restaurant is more than just a business. It's a part of this community. If the landlord wants to take it from us, they'll have to answer to more than just a piece of paper. Her husband nodded, his confidence returning as he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We've faced challenges before, he said. We'll face this one too. The waiter, who had been listening from a distance, stepped forward hesitantly. If there's anything I can do to help, he began, his voice tentative but sincere. The woman turned to him, her expression softening slightly. Thank you, she said. It's going to take all of us to get through this. And with that, the next chapter of their journey began, the stakes higher than ever, but their resolve stronger than before. As they prepared to fight for what they had built, one thing was certain. This was far from over. The weight of the landlord's sudden move lingered in the air, casting a shadow over what had already been a tumultuous day. The couple exchanged a glance, unspoken determination passing between them. They had built this restaurant with care, pouring their time, energy, and love into every detail. Giving up was not an option. After the representative left, the couple gathered their staff, including the still shaken waiter, for an impromptu meeting. The room buzzed with uncertainty, the usual lively atmosphere replaced by a tense silence. The owner spoke first, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Here's the situation," he began. "There's been a complication with our lease, and the landlord is trying to reclaim the property. We don't have all the details yet, but we're not going to let this happen without a fight." The staff exchanged nervous glances, but the woman stepped forward, her calm presence anchoring the room. "This restaurant is more than just a place to eat," she said. "It's a space for people to connect, to celebrate, and to feel welcome. We've faced challenges before, and we've come through stronger every time. This will be no different." The team nodded, their confidence bolstered by her words. Even the waiter, who had spent the day reflecting on his mistakes, seemed determined to redeem himself. "What can we do to help?" he asked, his voice quiet but earnest. The owner smiled faintly. "For now, keep doing what you do best," he said. "Take care of our guests, and show them why this place matters." In the days that followed, the couple threw themselves into action, consulting lawyers, reaching out to community leaders, and mobilizing their loyal customers. Word of the situation spread quickly, and the community rallied around them, signing petitions, sharing their story online, and showing up in droves to support the restaurant. The young mother who had returned to the restaurant that fateful day became one of their strongest advocates. She shared her story on social media, describing how the restaurant's kindness had made a difference in her life. Her post went viral, drawing attention from local news outlets and sparking an outpouring of support. Families, couples, and individuals who had fond memories of the restaurant shared their own experiences, painting a vivid picture of how deeply it had impacted their lives. Meanwhile, the landlord's representative began to feel the pressure. The unexpected public attention and growing backlash made it clear that reclaiming the property wouldn't be as straightforward as they had anticipated. The woman, ever resourceful, arranged a meeting with the landlord directly, refusing to let the future of the restaurant be decided behind closed doors. On the day of the meeting, she and her husband walked into the landlord's office with their heads held high. The room was sleek and impersonal, a stark contrast to the warmth of their restaurant. The landlord, an older man with a calculating gaze, regarded them with mild curiosity. "I've heard quite a bit about your restaurant lately," he said, his tone neutral. "You've certainly stirred up attention." "We're not here to stir up attention," the woman replied evenly. "We're here to protect what we've built. This isn't just a business. It's a cornerstone of the community." The landlord raised an eyebrow, but she pressed on, her voice unwavering. "We've worked tirelessly to make this restaurant a place where everyone feels valued. The support we've received over the past few days proves that it's not just important to us. It's important to the people who come through our doors every day." Her husband added, "We understand that there are legalities involved, but we're willing to negotiate. We're not looking for a fight. We're looking for a solution." The landlord leaned back in his chair, studying them. "You make a compelling case," he admitted. "But business is business." The woman smiled faintly, her eyes sharp. "Business is about relationships. And right now, you have an opportunity to build one with a community that values integrity and loyalty." The landlord's expression shifted, and for a moment, there was silence. Finally, he nodded. "I'll review the situation with my team," he said. "You'll hear from us soon." The wait for an answer was agonizing, but the couple continued to run the restaurant as usual, their staff and customers rallying around them with unwavering support. The waiter, in particular, threw himself into his work, determined to prove he could embody the values the restaurant stood for. He greeted every customer with genuine warmth, went out of his way to assist his colleagues, and even took on extra shifts to help out. When the landlord's decision finally came, It was delivered in a simple email. The lease would remain intact, and the restaurant could continue operating without interruption. The couple read the message together, relief and joy washing over them in equal measure. They immediately shared the news with their staff and customers, who erupted into cheers. The following weekend, the restaurant hosted a special event to thank the community for their support. The place was packed with familiar faces, from the young mother and her children to the bartender who had spoken up during the initial confrontation. Laughter and conversation filled the air, and the atmosphere was electric with gratitude and celebration. The woman stood at the center of it all, her husband by her side. She watched as people shared stories, reconnected, and created new memories, her heart full. This, she realized, was why they had fought so hard, not just for the restaurant itself, but for the sense of belonging it gave to everyone who walked through its doors. As the night wound down, the waiter approached her, a hesitant smile on his face. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, "for giving me another chance. I won't waste it." She smiled warmly. "You've already proven that you won't," she said. "Keep treating people with the respect they deserve, and you'll do just fine." The event ended with a toast, led by the couple, to the community that had stood by them in their time of need. Glasses clinked, laughter echoed, and the restaurant felt more alive than ever. In the end, the challenges they had faced only strengthened their resolve and deepened their appreciation for what they had built. The restaurant continued to thrive, not just as a business, but as a beacon of kindness, respect, and connection. And though the path had been difficult, it had brought them all closer together, proving that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most rewarding victories.